Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am Gbonde Wase Bey, Hajib, Secretary of State for Elodium Moorish Pradium Ante Colorado, a provincial government, a provincial state government under the existing and pre-existing sovereignty of the Moroccan Empire. And today we're going to continue with the right of Postliminium, which is written in the Law of Nations by Emir Vital, and it's in book 3, chapter 14, if you want to reference that. And the term Postliminium means to be restored to what was taken during war or during time of conflict or during time of battle or destruction, or having been conquered, to be restored to one's natural state. Okay? And this writing gives an explanation of all the parameters that entail Postliminium. Now, this term is important for us because our motto is Postliminium per consanguinity. And it is right in alignment with our Constitution, which is called the Law of Restoration. And of course, Postliminium means to be restored. Our Constitution is the Law of Restoration. So our whole intention and purpose for existing as a state, a nation, a body politic, is to be restored to our natural state as the autochthonous, aboriginal, indigenous people of the world, of North America, Northwest of Mexico, Northwest Africa, the Maghreb, the North Gate, Turtle Island, so forth and so on. So we'll continue with paragraph 208, and we'll continue with that. We finished the last session with that. It says, I read, "Now the right of Postliminium does not take effect in neutral countries, for when a nation chooses to remain neuter in a war, she is bound to consider it as equal justice on both sides, so far as relates to its effects, and consequently to look upon every capture made by either party as a lawful acquisition, to allow one of the parties in prejudice to the other, to enjoy her dominions, the right of claiming things taken by the latter, or the right of Postliminium would be declaring in favor of the former and departing from the line of neutrality." So, for instance, there are a few nations that we know of that are neutral, that have maintained a status of neutral in relationship to world conflicts. Those countries that are neutral do not take sides. They do not take sides even in favoring what might be just over another one that might be unjust. They do not take sides. They do not assist one side in gaining recovery of their property in Postliminium over another one gaining property over Postliminium. To do so would be to abrogate and to deny their own neutrality, which would be to put themselves in the war in a way that would bring harm to them, because one party would see favor over another. Okay? So Postliminium does not take effect in neutral countries, because those countries are not causing conflict or not usurping the natural rights and properties of the people that live there. So the next paragraph. "Naturally, every kind of property might be recovered by the right of Postliminium, and there is no intrinsic reason why movables should be accepted in this case, provided that they can be certainly recognized and identified. Accordingly, the ancients, on recovering such things from the enemy, frequently restored them to their former owners. But the difficulty of recognizing things of this nature and the endless disputes which would arise from the prosecution of those owners' claims to them have been deemed motives of sufficient weight for the general establishment of a contrary practice. To these considerations, we may add that from the little hope entertained of recovering effects taken by the enemy, and once carried to a place of safety, a reasonable presumption arises that the former owners have relinquished their property. It is therefore with reason that movables or booty are excepted from the right of postliminium, unless taken from the enemy immediately after his capture of them, in which case the proprietor neither finds a difficulty in recognizing his effects, nor is presumed to have relinquished them. And as the custom has been admitted, it is now well established, there would be an injustice in violating it. Among the Romans, indeed, slaves were not treated like other movable property. They, by the right of postliminium, were restored to their masters, even when the rest of the booty was detained. The reason of this is evident, for as it was at all times easy to recognize a slave and ascertain to whom he belonged, the owner still entertained hopes of recovering him, was not supposed to have relinquished his right. So, postliminium more easily applies to non-movables in this instance, meaning property, land, buildings, so to speak, meaning items of infrastructure and the like. But effects, simple effects, furniture, refrigerators, freezers, an automobile, anything that can be moved, carried away, is more difficult to reclaim. So there's been an exception to a degree in relationship to those items being postliminium, coming under that right. Now, if they were immediately taken, if there was a confiscation, and then an immediate retrieval, it's more easy to identify your property, identify your effects, and then able to retrieve them. Otherwise, they become part of a general pool of items, and it's much more difficult. And the likelihood of prosecution and disputes as to who owns what and what this and that, it becomes an insurmountable task for anybody to engage in. So they're most times were accepted as items of postliminium. Prisoners of war who have given their parole, territories, and towns, which have submitted to the enemy and have sworn or promised allegiance to him, cannot of themselves return to their former condition by the right of postliminium, for faith is to be kept even with enemies. Okay, prisoners of war. You could look at black-colored Negro African American people as prisoners of war. And we are housed in urban areas and ghettos and areas that are depressed financially, educationally, and every other way, and who have pledged their allegiance to those that conquered them. Okay? From having done that, those who stand under that allegiance do not have the right of postliminium. So postliminium is for those who have maintained their allegiance to their sovereign, to their nation, to their state. They have the right of postliminium, you see, every right. But if you have pledged your allegiance to your enemy, you've given up the right of postliminium. And this is what our people don't understand. You can't pledge allegiance to the enemy and expect the enemy to give you favor in relationship to having been an enemy with them. Once you pledge allegiance, you become a willful prisoner of war, and you come under their rule, their subjugation. Your right of postliminium disappears. It's gone. So when we have Moors speaking at cross purposes, they're saying, I'm a Moor, I have rights. And then they quote the Constitution, which is a constitution for the United States of America. And the Moors are not citizens of the United States of America, but they're going to quote the Constitution as giving them rights. There's a disconnect there. They call it cognitive dissonance. And we don't even know that we've had it. We've all been in it. We've all done it. We thought that that was the way to go for so long. And it was misrepresented to us by those who believed that that was the way to go, who were taught that that was the way to go. You see? But we gave up the right of postliminium. Now, there have been people that have gone and claimed properties. And some of those people, they were arrested, they were put out of those properties. At the same time, there was court actions, and some of those people were prosecuted, and they did not have to go back to jail because they won their cases against the prosecution, because they do have rights as under consanguinity in terms of claim of land and so forth and so on, but they don't have a nation, and they didn't have the proper infrastructure to claim land lawful or under law that is theirs by international right. You see, that's the difference. That's the difference. That's an act of postliminium. Doing it under law through national right. Next paragraph. But if the sovereign retakes those towns, countries, or prisoners who had surrendered to the enemy, he recovers all his former rights over them and is bound to reestablish them in their pristine condition. In this case, they enjoy the right of postliminium without any breach of their word, any violation of their plighted faith. The enemy loses by the chance of war at right, which the chance of war had before given him. But concerning prisoners of war, a distinction is to be made. If they were entirely free on their parole, the single circumstance of their coming again into the power of their own nation does not release them, since, even if they had returned home, they would still have continued as prisoners. The consent of the enemy who had captured them, or his total subjugation, can alone discharge them. But if they have only promised not to effect their escape, a promise which prisoners frequently make in order to avoid the inconveniences of a jail, the only obligation incumbent upon them is that they shall not, of themselves, quit the enemy's country or the place assigned for their residence. And if the troops of their party should gain possession of the place where they reside, the consequence is that by the right of war, they recover their liberty, are restored to their own nation, and reinstated in their former condition. So, what are we saying? This is what is happening. All of this is about the Moors. It's about us. We can apply it to our situation specifically. If the sovereign retakes these towns, countries, or prisoners, we reclaim our people, the ipso jure Moorish subjects, and all of them come under the nation. Then what happens is they are to be restored to their pristine condition by international law. Now, as prisoners, if they're prisoners under act of war, but yet they agreed not to escape and they didn't spend time in jail, they can still be restored under postliminium. Because in order to do that, they had to claim some kind of allegiance to the enemy that captured them. But once their sovereign comes in and frees them, they can then again claim the right of postliminium. So it doesn't matter if a person has gone their entire life as a Negro, Black, and colored African American prisoner of war who's pledged an allegiance to the enemy. They can come back once they realize who they are, that the sovereign is there to save them, they can come and claim Postliminium and come into the proper status, into their pristine status, their pristine order, condition, and reclaim themselves. That's the beauty of this. So this is very powerful. This is very powerful. Because what's happening is we're involved with not just reclaiming the land, we're reclaiming our people, we're reclaiming our consciousness, we're reclaiming our children, we're reclaiming everything that makes us who we are. We're reclaiming our culture, we're reclaiming everything you can imagine, everything that's described in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's what we're reclaiming. Our right of self-determination, our right to establish an economic base, our right to establish our own lands, our right to oversee the use of those lands and the development of those lands to make sure that those lands are used properly. We have the right of Postliminium to engage ourselves in every facet of the use of our dominions. And as a result, we take our position as the rightful tenants, as the rightful landlords, for the tenants to resume their duty of paying their obligations. Okay, let's go on. When a town is reduced by the enemy's arms, it is taken by those of her own sovereign. When a town reduced by the enemy's arms is taken by those of her own sovereign. Retaken, that's right. Retaken by those of her own sovereign. She is, as we have above seen, restored to her former condition and reinstated in the possession of all her rights. When they use the feminine her, they're talking about the nation, the sovereign. Okay, our nation. It is asked whether she thus recovers such part of her property as had been alienated by the enemy while he kept her in subjection. In the first place, we are to make a distinction between movable property not recoverable by the right of Postliminium and immovables. Make that distinction. In World War II, there was a great deal of theft that took place of precious metals, artifacts, artworks, sculptures, all kinds of things were taken. Those are movables. Okay? Now, through the right of Postliminium, there were people and groups of peoples that were able to reclaim many of those things. Okay? Now, in some of those places that were destroyed by the enemy, the people were able to come in and retake those. The Allies were able to come in and retake certain towns. Those towns were to be restored to their former condition and reinstated in possession of all their rights, which was the right of Postliminium. So they went through a process of reclaiming things that had been stolen. So if they had a registry of some sort, if they had a list, a ledger of some sort, they were able to reclaim those items. Otherwise, those items are still in storage, waiting for somebody to claim them. And probably a lot of them have been auctioned off because no one's claimed them. The former belongs to the enemy who gets it into his hands, the former being movables. The former belongs to the enemy who gets it into his hands, and he may irrevocably alienate it. So when the enemy comes in and sacks a town or an area or village or whatever, they take whatever they take, and they are alienating that property from the people. Now, once it's alienated, and the longer it's alienated from those people, and the longer the distance it is away from them, it becomes the right of Postliminium is decreased. Time and distance. So if they come and they sack a town, and then right behind them comes your sovereign with their forces and takes over those that sack the town and reclaims those items that have been alienated, those items can be taken directly to that area that had been sacked, and then those who know what items were theirs can reclaim them. And those disputes become localized, and they just have to deal with that. But it's being restored to those people. Now, if they get away with it, so to speak, then it's permanently alienated. It's irrevocably alienated. That means it's out of their picture. They can't be revoked. It becomes their property, and they're gone with it. Okay? As to immovables, that which can't be moved, let it be remembered that the acquisition of a town taken in war is not fully consummated till confirmed by a treaty of peace or by the entire submission or destruction of the state to which it belonged. Okay? So if there's a treaty of peace, then the party that was conquered has to be restored. If there is total submission to the nation that did the conquering, then the right of postliminium goes away, because the conquering state will then confer upon those who submitted, and submission includes renouncing allegiance and oath and taking a new allegiance and oath. Then it's not postliminium that's restored, it's a new set of rights, a new status, a new whatever in relationship to that new state that comes in and assumes that area. Go ahead.
Then how can we claim postliminium?
Postliminium?
Yeah.
We can claim postliminium because we've wakened up. We've awakened. We've returned. So entire submission. Okay, let's say, for instance, after the forced servitude from 1774 to 1865, that was forced submission. Okay, so after that, there were attempts to try to reinstate or reclaim, but there wasn't a new state established. You see, that was the big flaw that our people had made, and there were so many of our own people that were in the way of that. So once a new state is established, that state, through a treaty of peace, can work to restore the people to their pristine state, their pristine condition, prior to having been conquered. Because the state is made up of the people. And when the people come under that state and they've taken allegiance, they renounce the allegiance, so they're no longer under submission. So they have the right of postliminium to be restored. Till then, the sovereign of that town has hopes of retaking it or of recovering it by a peace. And from the moment it returns into his power, he restores it to all its rights. So once the nation, the sovereign, is restored and comes into the town in the hopes of retaking it and retakes it and recovers it to its peace, from that moment, it returns to the power of the nation. That town returns to its own power as well. It is restored to all of its rights. And consequently, it recovers all its possessions. As far as in their nature, they are recoverable. It therefore resumes its immovable possessions from the hands of all those persons who had been so prematurely forward to purchase them. And that's what happens sometimes. People will go into an affected area, and because something has been a devastation, they'll go in and, under the guise of assisting people, loan money, or just outright buy a property that had been destroyed, and the people will feel like they have something that they can take and move forward with, but they lose their property in the process. Or it's mortgaged to the point where the people loaning the money know it can never be paid back. So the collateral for that is the land. They take the land. You see. But under the right of Postliminium, even in those circumstances, once the sovereign comes in and restores that town or that area, those people that have come in to usurp other people by buying property, that Postliminium overrides that. And those people can be restored. Because under duress, people will make decisions that they don't realize are not for their best interest. In buying them of one who had not an absolute right to dispose of them, the purchaser has made a hazardous bargain, and if they prove losers by the transaction, it is a consequence to which they deliberately expose themselves. It's like saying, too bad, so sad.
Buyer beware.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
But if that town had been ceded to the enemy by a treaty of peace, or was completely fallen into his power by the submission of the whole state, she has no longer any claim to the right of Postliminium, and the alienation of any of her possessions by the conqueror is valid and irreversible, nor can she lay claim to them if, in the sequel, some fortunate revolution should liberate her from the yoke of the conqueror. So that once the state has given it up, once it's been relinquished, once you gave it up, you can't get it back. You see? So it almost sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. Go ahead.
For the record, your brother, I was just going to mention the resolution 75 is what sellout Morris tried to give away our sovereignty and give away our Postliminium rights by pledging allegiance as being United States citizens.
Mm.
But they couldn't do it because they wasn't even a state. They were more subjects. They had no sovereign rights because they hadn't created a state.
Mm-hmm. And that resolution 75 only applied to the Philadelphia Moors that were part of that Moor society in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
That's all they could speak for. When Alexander made a present to the Thessalians of the sum due from them to the Thebans, he was so absolutely master of the Republic of Thebes that he destroyed the city and sold the inhabitants. No one had right of Postliminium at that point. The same decisions hold good with regard to the immovable property of individuals, prisoners or not, which has been alienated by the enemy while he was the master of the country. Grotius proposes the question with respect to immovable property possessed in a neutral country by a prisoner of war. But according to the principles we have laid down, this question is groundless. For the sovereign who makes a prisoner in war has no other right over him than that of detaining his person until the conclusion of the war or until he be ransomed. But he acquires no right to the prisoner's property unless he can seize on it. It is impossible to produce any natural reason by why the captor should have a right to dispose of his prisoner's property unless the prisoner has it about him. Okay? So this is it's very, very clear, very specific. It's like when a person who's put in prison, if they don't have their property on them, it cannot be seized. That's why a party who has their affairs structured properly and has their estate structured properly, where their assets and their holdings are in trust. If something happens and an enemy combatant, like policy enforcer or highwayman, comes and arrests you, they have no access to any of your property. And when you're released, you have the right of Postliminium to be restored to it completely in a pristine fashion. I like that word, pristine. Okay. When a nation, a people, a state has been entirely subdued, it is asked whether a revolution can entitle them to the right of postliminium. In order to justly answer this question, there must again be a distinction of cases. If that conquered state has not yet acquiesced in her new subjection, has not voluntarily submitted, and has only ceased to resist from inability, if her victor has not laid aside the sword of conquest and taken up the scepter of peace and equity, such a people are not really subdued. They are only defeated and oppressed. And on being delivered by the hands of an ally, they doubtless return to their former situation. Their ally cannot become their conqueror. He is their deliverer, and all the obligation of the party delivered is to reward him. If the subsequent conqueror, not being an ally to the state of which we speak, intends to keep it under his own jurisdiction as the reward of his victory, he puts himself in the place of the former conqueror and becomes the enemy of the state which the other had oppressed. That state may lawfully resist him and avail herself of a favorable opportunity to recover her liberty. If she had been unjustly oppressed, he who rescues her from the yoke of the oppressor ought generously to reinstate her in the possession of all her rights. Okay.
I like that one.
This is even more clearly our situation. When a nation, a people, a state has been entirely subdued, the Moorish nation, the Moorish empire has been subdued. The people have been subdued through the forced servitude. And the state has been subdued. And we look at all the Moorish nations that were in North America have been subdued. Their names changed in many cases. Their status altered. Those who were who are descendants of the forced servitude have their entire status altered. Even what they call themselves altered. They don't even have nation names anymore.
They have no jurisdiction.
No jurisdiction. And they have no state. It's been totally subdued. Okay? A revolution can entitle them to postliminium. Okay? Now, let's say, for instance, we seek an ally. And that ally is in place to help us reclaim and restore and reinstate our state, our nation, and our people.
Would that be France?
France or whoever else can become a justifiable ally. That party, that ally, if they take advantage of the situation to use it to subdue and subjugate for their gain, we have the right to revolt and claim we still retain our right of postliminium. You see, no country can take another country's right of postliminium away from them unless that country gives it up willingly. This is the whole intent of postliminium. If you did not give it away voluntarily, you have a right to reclaim it. That's the whole process. We did not give land away voluntarily. Land was not sold, it was stolen. And then what appeared to be sold was simply a transfer of jurisdictional control. Even the Treaty of Hidalgo, Guadalupe in 1848 was a treaty of usurpation. The people that lived on the land did not voluntarily give the land to the United States. And they did not voluntarily give their status away and become United States citizens. But through usurpation and miseducation and misrepresentation and through betrayal by their sovereign country, they were given over they still have a right of postliminium. They don't know it. They don't have a state, you see. And that's the dilemma that the peoples of North America are in. Those who are the usurpers and those who have been usurped. Okay? And those who have been usurped have the right of postliminium. The question changes with regard to a state which has voluntarily submitted to the conqueror. If the people no longer treated as enemies, but as actual subjects, have submitted to a lawful government, they are thenceforward dependent on a new sovereign, or being incorporated with the victorious nation, they become a part of it and share its fate. The former state is absolutely destroyed. All its relations, all its alliances are extinguished. Whoever then the new conqueror may be, that afterwards subdues the state to which these people are united, they share the destiny of that state, as a part shares the fate of the whole. This has been the practice of nations in all ages. I say even of just and equitable nations, especially with regard to an ancient conquest. The most moderate conqueror confines his generosity, in this particular, to the restoration of the liberties of a people who have been but recently subdued, and whom he does not consider as perfectly incorporated or well cemented by inclination with the state which he has conquered. There we go. You get down to consent. If you consent, you don't have the right of postliminium. But as soon as you wake up and you retract that consent, because consent is a contractual issue, you can retract that consent and you make another agreement, and that agreement has to be in alignment with a state. That agreement affords you the right of postliminium.
Good brother, you're talking about your consent of saying that you are Black, African American, white.
Yeah.
Consenting to that.
Mm-hmm. You're consenting to be a United States citizen. You're consenting to the status that they put upon you. You consented to everything that they've done to you in education, what they're doing to your children, the medical warring that they're doing against people, all of that. You're consenting to it. And there's millions of people that are consenting to it.
But they also wrote in their Declaration, 1948, Declaration of Human Rights 15, 2, our people can come right up out of that consent.
Exactly.
If they want to.
Exactly.
At any time in their life.
Mm-hmm. At any time someone is falling, they can pull that parachute cord.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they don't have a parachute cord, then they don't have the right of postliminium. So they got to get one from somebody else that's falling, who's getting ready to pull theirs.
Meaning they have to have a state.
That's state. That's right. You stated it right. Okay. If the people in question shake off the yoke and recover their liberty by their own exertions, they regain all their rights. Speaks exactly what you were saying, Kanye. They return to their former situation, and foreign nations have no right to determine whether they have shaken off the yoke of lawful authority or burst the chains of slavery. So no one else gets to determine your status but you. Thus, the kingdom of Portugal, which had been seized on by Philip II, King of Spain, under pretense of an hereditary right, but in reality by force and the terror of his arms, reestablished the independency of her throne and recovered her former rights when she drove out the Spaniards and placed the Duke of Braganza on the throne. You see? So at any moment when people wake up, they can restore themselves. If there is a state to support them, they can restore themselves. Provinces, towns, and lands which the enemy restores by the treaty of peace are certainly entitled to the right of postliminium, for the sovereign, in whatever manner he recovers them, is bound to restore them to their former condition as soon as he regains possession of them. The enemy, in giving back a town at the peace, renounces the right he had acquired by arms. It is just the same as if he had never taken it, and the transaction furnishes no reason which can justify the sovereign in refusing to reinstate such town in the possession of all her rights and restore her to her former condition. This is very, go ahead.
So this is true civilization in operation.
This is an attempt at civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it is when war has been engaged in and people are being subjugated and people's rights have been abrogated and their properties have been destroyed and their possessions have been stolen. This is an equitable way of dealing with that. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily civil. It's an attempt at civilization. Mm-hmm. The reason that the postliminium is needed is because we're not civilized. Our society is not civilized. Civilized society doesn't need postliminium because it's in the foundation of existence. Mm-hmm. This has to be applied to our existence. It has to be applied by the state for the people. It has to be applied in relationship to other states. You see, because unfortunately, people have learned the nature of how to steal. This is a way to circumvent that in international law, you see. Going on. But whatever is ceded to the enemy by a treaty of peace is truly and completely alienated. It has no longer any claim to the right of postliminium unless the treaty of peace be broken and canceled. Okay? So that's something we have to look at when we talk about adopting certain treaties. Making sure that certain things that might be in place don't affect us adversely in that regard and don't abrogate our right of postliminium. As things not mentioned in the Treaty of Peace remain in the condition in which they happen to be at the time when the treaty is concluded and are, on both sides, tacitly ceded to the present possessor, it may be said in general that the right of postliminium no longer exists after the conclusion of the peace. That right entirely relates to the state of war. What is the state of war between two nations? Will determine the right of postliminium. Nevertheless, and for this very reason, there is an exception to be made here in favor of prisoners of war. Their sovereign is bound to release them at the peace. But if he cannot accomplish this, if the fate of war compels him to accept of hard and unjust conditions, the enemy who ought to set the prisoners at liberty when the war is terminated and he has no longer anything to fear from them, continues the state of war with respect to them, if he still detains them in captivity, and especially if he reduces them to slavery. They have, therefore, a right to effect their escape from him if they have an opportunity, and to return to their own country equally as in wartime, since with regard to them the war still continues, and in that case the sovereign, from his obligation to protect them, is bound to restore them to their former condition. That's pretty self-explanatory. And under international law, if you're a prisoner of war, you have an obligation to seek an escape, to find a way to release yourself from your captors and to return to your sovereign. And your sovereign then has a right, the obligation to return you to your natural condition prior to the war. Further, those prisoners who are without any lawful reason detained after the conclusion of peace become immediately free when once escaped from captivity, they have even reached a neutral country, for enemies are not to be pursued and seized on neutral ground. And whoever detains an innocent prisoner after the peace continues to be his enemy. This rule should and actually does obtain among nations who do not admit and authorize the practice of enslaving prisoners of war. So these prisoners that effect their escape into neutral countries can find their way back to their sovereign and are entitled to be restored through Postliminium. It is sufficiently evident from the premises that prisoners are to be considered as citizens who may one day return to their country, and when they do return, it is the duty of the sovereign to reestablish them in their former condition. Hence, it clearly follows that the rights of every one of those prisoners, together with his obligations or the rights of others over him, still subsist undiminished. Only the exertion of them is, for the most part, suspended during the time of his captivity. So it talks about his restoration. The prisoner of war, therefore, retains a right to dispose of his property, particularly in case of death. And as there is nothing in the state of captivity which can in this latter respect deprive him of the exercise of his right, the testament of a prisoner of war ought to be valid in his own country, unless rendered void by some inherent defect. So a prisoner of war, by his word, can dispose of his property, can exercise his right of postliminium. Because having been a prisoner of war, he's been in a situation where he has not been privy to everything that's going on. All he knows is what was before. So when he comes, he doesn't have the privy of anything to use as a machination or device to usurp someone. All he has is what he left with when he went to war.
So this reading and this, and the explanation that goes with it really demonstrates the importance of nationhood or state, because and it also reveals the lack of a better word, dastardliness of denationalizing whole regions of people worldwide.
Oh yeah, that's an act of war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you see, as you're reading, I'm remembering exchanges of prisoners and nations making up and all that kind of stuff. So that proves to me how true this is. But it's only true to those that still have a nation to go to.
Exactly.
That is politically sound. And
When Abraham Lincoln was president, and he set up the Refugees, Freedmen, and the Department of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Land. Okay, he knew the law of Postliminium. He knew about this. He was a lawyer. He knew about this. They all knew about this. Okay, this is why this is why the brand names were put on people, so that they could war against people without it looking like war. You see, they could shoot bullets that didn't have any lead. They had words. You see, and so what happened was, this has been going on from day one. So the whole idea of restoring, refugees, freedmen, and abandoned land was to restore the Moors. It was an act of postliminium. It was restoring those who had been conquered, who had been subject to servitude, who had been sold as slaves, quote unquote.
What was that? And refugees, freedmen, and what?
Abandoned land.
Okay.
And so it was an acknowledgement that the land that was going to be given was given back to them. It wasn't land that was just going to be ceded from the United States to these people that were foreigners. It was land to be given back to the people who were natural to the land. That act in itself was an act of telling. If people were listening, and some people were listening, they didn't like it. And that's one of the reasons why he got shot in the head and hanged. We don't know which happened first.
Lincoln?
Yeah.
He was hanged and
Yeah.
shot in the head.
Well, they said he was shot in the head, but he was. They say also he was hanged. It depends on the narrative.
Hey.
So that whole process was a way for the United States of America to come into right relationship in the international community. But it did not. It chose to take another path, which is to war within itself against those that it was to restore. It was called a civil war. And then they legislated the state servitude, the continuation of the war against the people in the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. And the people accepted it because they had the 13th Amendment. Not the original 13th Amendment. It's the one that said end of slavery. So that concludes. We're probably going to continue this another day. This is good stuff
It is.
because it helps you understand why we're doing what we're doing. This is not just a game that we're playing because we have rights. You know, we have the right of Postliminium. I'm a Moor. You know, this is not just why we're doing this. There's law, there's international law, there's international accords, there's treaties that we come under. The Treaty of Peace and Friendship has three parties that are represented in there. Moors, Americans, United States citizens. We are Moors. We are not United States citizens. It was very clear at that time who was who and what was what. And we've been taught over the years that we are something totally different so that we don't have access to what Moors have access to and have had access to. So we'll resume next time with the section on marriage and Postliminium.
Yeah.
And that's subsection 221. So we'll remember that, subsection 221.
Thank you.
Thank you for your hearing, your seeing, and your understanding.
Thank
Peace
you.
and love.
Peace and love. Thank you, bro.
This is great.
Peace and love.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I am Gbonde Wase Bey. Hajib.